is Steve Thornton, and I'm a lead game designer. I have about 10 years of experience, 2 game design degrees, and I'm here today with DevGAMM Online to talk about engagement. After my previous talks, I got some feedback that before starting the topic, people might like a bit more information about my history and experience, so today we're going to start with a short crash course through my career thus far. Skipping over the work I did with a small mobile company, my first studio experience was a hat trick of summer work placements at TT Games, at the time better known as Traveller's Tales, and now best known as the home of the LEGO video game franchise. My first placement was on one of their few non-LEGO titles, Guinness World Records. My task was to playtest its many games to help choose the trophy grades for the high score table. I went back the next summer to work in LEGO Rock Band, where my job was to set up the cameras in the game's various arenas, ensuring they didn't clip and rearranging the camera and band members if they did. I often joke I worked in the part that nobody's actually looking at when they play. My third placement was on LEGO Star Wars 3 The Clone Wars, and became my first job offer. I joined TT as a junior game designer, working mostly on level design, paper plans and asset requests, all the way to hands-on integration in their proprietary editor. I continued working in similar roles on a variety of LEGO titles. Along the way I took on more system design and ownership, and I was promoted to game designer, senior game designer and eventually assistant game director. After playing AGD a few times, I didn't see a clear path to director, so I transferred on to a different internal team at TT with a different structure, and my title became lead level designer. However, just one project later, they lured me back with a game director job after all, on LEGO Ninjago Shadow of Ronin. Fun fact alert, the subtitle was a working name I used for the project as a homage to a game from my childhood, and magically it got all the way from the page to the shelf without any intervention from opinionated publishers or IP holders. The first and probably last game I got to actually give its name, and it was a total accident. There was a time without any projects to direct, so I helped out on LEGO Star Wars Force Awakens, taking ownership of the combat system in some levels. My last project at TT was Ninjago again. I did the initial game design document and greenlight pitch for the Ninjago movie video game, but before I started development, I left TT for a new studio. I moved to St. Petersburg in Russia, where I now work at a co-development studio called Sperasoft. Co-development involves supporting other studios whose workload has outgrown their internal resources. Unlike outsourcing, co-development includes taking some of the creative responsibility, usually ownership of a specific feature or chunk of the game. Sperasoft is part of the Keywords Group and has over 600 people working across 3 development studios, the one I'm at in St. Petersburg, plus one in Volgograd, and one in Krakow, Poland. Our partners are some of the biggest and best game studios and publishers in the world, including EA, Ubisoft, Bethesda, Rockstar, Riot Games, and NetherRealms, just to name a few. You may not have heard of Sperasoft, but I bet you've heard of some of their projects. My first project with Sperasoft was Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, where I contributed to the post-launch seasonal updates, working closely with the great people at Ubisoft Montreal. I joined Sperasoft as a senior designer, but within a few months was promoted back to lead again. After Rainbow, I joined an existing Sperasoft team that was working on the wildlife systems for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and was there for a few months before moving on to my current project, which is unfortunately still under NDA, which is a real shame, because it's one of the most exciting projects I've ever done. But c'est la vie, hopefully Sperasoft's role will be announced very soon. Keep an eye on my Twitter, I'll be announcing it as soon as I can. As you can see, I've worked with a lot of different games, teams, clients, intellectual properties, genres and types of design. Making the jump between such different tasks and titles, I've had a lot of opportunity to find the transferable skills and philosophies that underpin good game design choices, no matter what you're working on. Also, as I've been in a senior or leadership role for almost half my career, I've often been tasked with mentoring younger designers, a job that calls on you to articulate your techniques and preferences in a way that others, even those less experienced in the industry, can digest and apply. A lot of game designers find this difficult. In fact, I've had many spirited debates with close designer friends who argue that game design is inherently unpredictable and cannot be structured. While I choose to die on the opposite hill, which is that we owe it to our teams and ourselves to identify and articulate the things that make games work and make informed choices. In my opinion, instinct is just structure that you aren't fully processing. This is my talk for DevGAMM 2020, Rules of Engagement. We're going to talk about some of my personal techniques for engaging the player and how they can be used to train players to interact with your game the way that you want. For some of you, these insights may feel obvious, at least at first, but the first step is always putting words to things that feel obvious. One benefit of the online format is full control over the talk length and timing, so sit back and relax. It's the last talk on the last day and we're all at home, so I assume you already have a drink. I know I do. So, we're going to talk about some of the games I worked on, as well as some of my favourite games from the last couple of years and beyond. There's going to be case studies and videos, even a chart if you're into that kind of thing. Hopefully you hear something that benefits your own work, increases your appreciation of some of these games, or just resonates with you. Either way, if you like game design, this is going to be a fun 30-40 minutes. In this talk, we consider engagement to essentially be a measurement of how much attention the player is giving your game, aka how much of the player's total available brain power is consumed by interacting with your game, and how much is left behind in the real world. High engagement is when the game demands a state of intense focus, total attention, leaning forward in your chair, watching closely, tongue out of your mouth, palm sweaty, mum spaghetti, you are the ball, be the ball, there is no spoon. Low engagement is relaxed, you're giving the game a portion of your attention and you're happy to leave it there, but you're still able to hold conversations and your heart rate is unremarkable. So if we're considering engagement to be a measurement of how much brain is taken by the game, the first question when we're talking about engagement is simple. What is the player thinking? Video games are about interaction, and interaction is all about choices. Why do players make the choices that they do? What goes on in their heads? My breakdown of a player choice looks like this. Obstacle, analysis, action, payoff. Players encounter an obstacle, something that requires an action from them. Using the information that they have, they decide on what action to take. If they choose the correct action, execute it successfully, boom, they are rewarded. There's a payoff. That part is very important, but I won't be spending too much time on it here, as the rewards can vary massively depending on the action and the type of game. Nonetheless, all the variables that affect the player's challenges, that create friction and thus frustration or satisfaction in the player, they all happen at some point during this 4-step breakdown. All interactions in a game fit inside it, from the micro to the macro. The obstacle that starts this process might be a gap to jump, an incoming attack, it can be a wall to climb or to smash, it could be an outpost full of enemies or a single enemy with a specific weakness, a tight bend in the road of a driving game, a certain colour of gem rushing down a track towards you, a wire that needs a pulley, or an exit you seemingly can't reach. Players find that answer by comparing the information presented to them about the obstacle with all the information that they are carrying from their previous experiences. Sometimes from previous parts of that game, sometimes from similar games they have played, or even from real life. This is the analysis stage, and it can boil extremely complicated assessments into a single moment, or turn simple recognition into a victory. It can be as simple as finding the right key for a locked door. The rush of, oh, I know what this is for, can be enough to whisk your player from one task to the next, because they know when they get there they're going to win, just a little bit. The levels in a LEGO video game are essentially built on a drip feed of these little satisfactions. What are sometimes referred to in LEGO games as puzzles, even within TT, almost always amount to spotting the next interactive object, swapping to a character that can interact with it, pressing the use button, and enjoying whatever happens next, usually a shower of studs, a big animation, and access to the next interactive object. Players are carried through the game with a constant stream of simple interactions and big payoffs. You might consider LEGO games to be a low engagement series that rarely gets players leaning forward in their chairs. But LEGO games offer the basics of engagement. They get players reading and reacting to the world, keeps them asking questions, and maintains their desire to keep playing one obstacle at a time. I used to say if LEGO games were a type of music, they'd be easy listening. There's very little pressure being exerted on the player during the analysis or action stages. The analysis is easy, as the objects are paired directly with the abilities, like locks to keys, and the actions are rarely more complicated than a single button press. But it is just asking enough, regularly enough, to keep most players engaged. There's always another lock in sight and the key is always in reach, so why not turn it? So how does the player know what to do in a LEGO game? In any video game level, you can divide all the objects into two categories, interactive and non-interactive. The majority of the level will be static geometry. Within that environment sit the objects that the player can interact with. One thing that designers need to do is teach players how to identify which is which by establishing a visual language. Helpfully, in most LEGO games, all the interactive objects immediately stand out from the non-interactive because everything interactive is made out of bricks and everything else isn't. Almost every LEGO mechanic is as simple as a special object that only a particular character or ability can interact with. When players see that object, they should know immediately what ability they need. Depending on the IP, these abilities may be iconic to particular characters or divided by character category. Other times they can be seen on the characters as a tool they are carrying. Either way, a relationship is taught, this object requires this ability. The object will either be exactly the same every time, like a twirl pole or crawl space, or something that can be attached to other objects to extend their influence, like the grapple plugs or electric battery. Other times, the object can be a different shape every time, but with a specific color or material to define its type. E.g., silver LEGO objects can only be destroyed by explosives, gold LEGO objects can be destroyed by lasers or heat weapons, and these rules tend to be consistent across the entire franchise. It's almost insultingly simple, right? Sweeping statement number 1, all games are LEGO games. A little bit. This is obviously a very gamey approach, and less easier spotted in bright childish worlds like the LEGO games or the Nintendo catalogue, but it's still pretty overt in massive AAA blockbusters, such as Lara's Tools in Tomb Raider, Batman's Gadgets in Arkham City, and in the extensive platforming of Doom Eternal and Jedi Fallen Order. Most games have an object-based language. It's always more obvious in games that have an expanding skill set for the player, particularly those with Metroidvania elements, because they need especially clear object relationships in order for players to internalize what new map routes have been opened once they gain a new ability, which is pretty similar to how free play works in LEGO games. However, it's no less true in games that stick true to the player's natural set of abilities. Climbable walls, shuffleable edges, grapple points, smooth walls for running on, all of them are styled either with consistent elements or materials, or in contrast to the surrounding environment, or in some cases easily identifiable spatial clues and environmental shapes. Just like how LEGO games have their brick trick, all games must find a way for their gameplay space to stand out from the artwork around it. Most of these examples are binary pairings, one lock to one key, but of course games can teach the player more versatile rules via types and categories. These can have wildly differing visuals, but they share common traits and common rules. Recent From Software masterpiece, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, categorizes attack types such as projectiles, thrusts, grabs, and sweeps, with different player counters for each that work against all attacks of that type. It also introduces weaknesses for certain categories of enemy. Firecrackers stun animals, the axe shatters shields, the umbrella hat blocks projectiles, divine confetti buffs your sword against the supernatural and the creepy. Both the designers and players have to work a little bit harder to teach and learn what fits in each category, but it still forms a very strong language between the game and the player. And ultimately, more effort in the analysis stage generates value that translates to more satisfaction later. Essentially, step 1 is the process of creating affordances. Affordances are the properties an object has which implies or shows how a user might interact with it, such as the handle of a cup or the sharp end of a knife. For the game designer, this can be showing that a natural affordance applies in this game world, or creating an artificial affordance from something that doesn't usually have a strong place in the real world as a rule. In this case, rules are the interactions that each object supports and the action the game expects or accepts from the player. I mentioned earlier that players bring in expectations for how things will interact that are based either on the real world, like don't drink that, or don't touch that, or from long established game rules like red bar I'll go bang, keeping in mind that not everybody has the second type of knowledge. This is why one of the fastest ways to establish rules within your game world is to base them on the rules of the real world so players can answer the game's questions with a real world logic. Some of Sekiro's relationships fit these expectations also. But by far the most popular example of this are the elements. Everyone comes in with an expectation of how those elements will interact and behave. Fire melts ice, water makes grass grow, extreme cold plus water creates ice. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's development team did an excellent GDC talk called Bricking Conventions, where they talk about creating the simulation elements of their world by building not a physics engine, but a chemistry engine. Every element had a way it interacted with the others and the different object types in the world. Systemic designs like this allow players to learn a set of global rules rather than individual relationships, and they can make predictions about how objects will interact based on their properties alone. Rainbow Six Siege is also built in a chemistry set, a network of interactions between the operator gadgets and their environment, all of which are governed by types and categories. Mute's Jammer gadget cuts off remote-controlled gadgets from their masters, disabling drones and activation triggers. Thatcher's EMP grenades can destroy or disable electronic gadgets. Jaeger's ADS can auto-destroy projectile threats, including grenades and thrown or fired gadgets. Reinforced metal walls can only be breached with thermal weapons. Reinforced metal, electronic, mechanical, remote-triggered, most of these categories the player can understand using real-world common sense. When a brand new gadget is added to the game, its properties decide how it should interact with the existing systems in a way that is consistent with those expectations and the previous examples of those types meeting. Consistency. Players only adopt these relationships when they can completely trust them. A single exception in the analysis phase will be tainted by doubt, players may hesitate, get confused, and make bad choices. In his GDC talk, An Approach to Holistic Level Design, Steve Lee also talks about affordances, and how the level designers in Dishonored were forbidden from using the same mesh of a door that can be opened in one area as a door that is non-interactive in a different area. Similarly, in my LEGO teams, it was a capital design crime for a smashable object that provided to build it in one place to be empty somewhere else. But when time gets tight or teams get big, mistakes like that are easy to make. This does mean that the more systems and rules you create, the more limited you are. Once you say that white cloth can burn, you can't have a white cloth tint in the environment art. If you say all energy shields can be overloaded by your plasma gun, well, you shouldn't have one that can't. Shouldn't. The larger the game's rule set becomes, the more design decisions are made by what is already in the game. So, what has all this to do with engagement? Well, if it wasn't obvious, this is how you train your player to engage with your game world, confidently, comfortably, quickly. If the player is ever lost or confused, it is because they are stuck in the analysis phase, and if that is the case, it will almost always be because one of these steps has failed. The player can't work out what they're meant to be interacting with, or the thing they need to interact with is not being clear enough about what type of interaction it accepts, possibly because the related rule is being broken, or because it was broken previously, or because you didn't teach that rule well enough. Assuming they navigate these pitfalls, the player has chosen their action and now they have to execute it. Although some actions can simply be a button press, others won't be successful until players pass a skill check. Some example skills that the game might check at the action stage are precision, aka the action must be executed within a certain window of time or space. Parrying is a good example. Accuracy, your action may miss if not aimed correctly, making it hard to execute the simplest point and click puzzle of all, use gun on head. Dexterity, or finger foo, this action is demanding on your fragile human body. See also pro player finger grips and button transitions. The bigger the skill check on the action, the more friction it creates, and thus the more value it brings to the flow to the payoff stage. But as we know, skill checks are tricky to balance because every player brings their own skill floor and ceiling. Designers can work to check and raise these levels within the game, but ultimately some players who find the skill checks on the edge of their reach or simply outside it will be alienated and not reach the payoff stage enough to stick around and play the rest of your game. Most games don't really have huge skill checks on individual actions, or indeed ask for particularly challenging analysis. Instead, they allow players to master simple analysis and action pairings, and then exert external pressures that increase the challenge. There are a few major types of global pressures that are exerted upon the 4-step flow and make both the analysis and action phases harder to pass through successfully. They cause players to fumble their metaphorical keys. Lego games keep these pressures intentionally low, which is a big reason their engagement level stays quite low also. Pressure example number 1, time. Think fast. This is by far the most common pressure. Risk. How much will a mistake cost you? The more riding on each choice and action, the more pressure. Chaining, a variant of time pressure where you need to make multiple choices in a row without a break. Over time, this will likely lead to a slow analysis or a failed skill check. Multitasking. Several obstacles are active simultaneously. Since players literally cannot think of two things at once, it essentially creates an extra choice, that of choosing what obstacle to react to first, aka prioritization, that must be completed before any individual obstacle gets a chance to enter the choice flow. Good games with good level design will introduce and teach rules in isolation with very low pressure on top, and then gradually increase the pressure in its future appearances and allow it to mix with the other rules, leading to eventual mastery of that rule. This is how players absorb the rule into their repertoire, allowing them to pass through the analysis and action phase much faster and pass the skill checks more easily. Crucially, different obstacles require different responses from the player, ensuring they are constantly engaged with the game, checking for identifiers and reacting with the correct input, rather than finding comfort and thus eventually boredom in routine. Originally this talk was called the Bop It Theory, which I changed because people don't know what a Bop It is. This is a Bop It. It's a toy where there are multiple possible actions to perform. It tells the player which one to do, and then you've got a limited amount of time to do that thing, or you fail.
Twist it. Flick it. Spin it. Flick it. Bop it.
It's easy to spin it, to pull it, to bop it. The actions themselves are very simple, but you don't know which one is next, so you have to give it your full attention. It's the perfect engagement machine. Sweeping statement 2. All games can learn from the humble Bop It. Players become unengaged when they aren't thinking. To keep players thinking, you need variety. They need to not know if they're going to be spinning or pulling. If players can win fights by mashing the same attack, or can avoid every enemy attack with a block, they will start to skim or skip the analysis phase and slip into a routine, no longer engaging with the game's visual cues and likely neglecting some of the features that you want them to use. Note that the key word here is can, because if players can succeed at your game using a boring gameplay method, they will sacrifice fun for victory nearly every time. In the promotional interviews for Doom Eternal, creative director Hugo Martin talks about how he saw videos of people playing Doom 2016, where they were able to succeed with boring playstyles, neglecting most of the weapon wheel or using the same solutions for every problem. Eternal was thus specifically tuned to push players to their fun zone, to think constantly and use all the weapons and abilities at their disposal. If you want players to stay engaged and play your game the way that you want, you need to make the boring playstyles obsolete. And after balancing the incentives in the system design, the rest of this is about mixing up obstacles so players have to keep reading the game and changing their strategy, instead of finding a comfortable but boring zone where they are acting but not thinking. If you think again about the Bop It, the player's attention and engagement is maintained in the vacuum between actions because they need to stay ready to react to whatever happens next as fast as possible. They know that an action will be demanded at any moment, leaving them in a state of perpetual readiness. Readiness is a very high engagement state, during which players attempt to give their maximum attention, only to spike it even higher when the actions actually arrive. Most video game set pieces and bosses also put players in this state of readiness. But, and I shouldn't need to tell you game developers this, staying in your maximum engagement state constantly will eventually lead to burnout. So as well as applying pressure, you should be aware of how to release it, and give players beats where they can relax from the heightened state of acting and reset to the baseline readiness state, ready for the next obstacle. Even high pressure video games often provide short escapes. The most obvious example is slowing down time during some of the game's actions. Also, non-interactive animations such as finishers, cinematic transitions, or automated platforming are also times the player can briefly relax and reset their mental chain. Done correctly, these can create the right rhythm of pressure and venting, engaging and disengaging, that allows players to handle a high engagement state for longer periods of time. In order to keep players at max engagement, you need to let them dip out of it sometimes, like micro-pacing. As they say in jazz, it's the notes that you don't play. It's like game designer jazz. Equally, they will get bored if they aren't being asked for any choices for too long, such as in those really annoying parts where characters put their finger to their ear and walk really slowly.
Control, this is Delta. We're in.
Copy that. Keep moving through the factory till you find the cart control room. I'll use the carts to get you to the mine.
Delta.
But overstimulation can be just as disengaging. If the game exerts too much pressure on player choices, asking them to react too quickly or bombarding them with obstacles either simultaneously or really close together, players can't complete one choice flow before another one arrives. There's too much on-screen stimulus to pick up on the language, and players very quickly lose track of what is going on, and subsequently they give up or stop making informed choices and begin making actions randomly, the very same shortcut to boredom and disengagement as a game being too easy. You will need to find the right balance of information, skill checks and pressures to keep your intended audience in the engagement sweet spot. That is the key part. You need to understand how much your demographic of players can handle before their engagement turns sour. One player's zen state is another player's nightmare. Observe this chart. I know, you didn't think this was one of those serious academic talks, but I did promise a chart, and here it is. This shows the game's intensity of challenge, which here is a combination of the difficulty of the required skill checks and the amount of pressure on the player during them, versus the player's capability, which is their natural ability combined with the information and practice that you give them in the game itself. If their natural ability is too low, no amount of information and practice offered by the game will allow them to travel any further down the capability line, which means they will be unable to handle any more intensity. The balance is ensuring that the intensity stays aligned with the capability of each player, keeping them in the sweet spot, where the intensity demands engagement and pushes players to use their capability without going beyond it. If you take the popular pacing graph for intensity v time and imagine that it does actually apply to games, then that basically has to fit inside this zone for millions of different players, which is ironically a pretty intense challenge. When we're talking about game difficulty and player capability, I think it's important to remember a few things. Number one, natural ability may be impeded by health issues, not just a lack of what we often call skill. Two, we almost always simplify skill into one commodity when actually there are various different types of skills. I'm going to be guilty of that here, but it's a talk for another day. 3. A lower level of traditional skill does not prevent players from achieving a high engagement state. It just means that it happens at an intensity lower than it might happen for you. This location is not more engaging than this location. And 4. Not all games are striving for maximum engagement. Personally, I am happiest in this part of the graph, and I like games that take me to that place. Many players enjoy hanging out on the lower end of engagement, where it's relaxing and rewarding in a more meditative way, like LEGO games. I've come back to the LEGO series a lot in this talk, usually to show what they aren't doing. Most of these absences are totally intentional design choices intended to maximize accessibility. As I said earlier, they have a low ceiling and a low floor, but that low floor means that anyone can get on board. LEGO games do everything they can to get players on board, and they're extra cautious not to push or shake them out after that. Maybe you want to use these levers to do the opposite, and tune down your engagement requirement so that players can get to that chill place, the relaxation that occurs just short of boredom. However, if your intended audience is the core gamer looking for high pressure, big traditional skill checks, and you want to turn that engagement dial to 11 for them, then here we go. All of those highly stimulating videos from earlier may look insane and overwhelming to the untrained eye, but to the people who have played and mastered those games already, they can see through the noise. They can focus in on their avatar and the individual choices they need to make each moment. As the game designer, you are training your player, giving them the information and practice needed to turn analysis into instinct and skill checks into skills, so they can read your game's language even in the most manic of situations. This is what prepares players to ride along with your game's most engaging and memorable moments. Its biggest set pieces, most intense fights, tensest boss battles. When your player is in them and winning, that's what you're working towards. That is a maximum engagement zone. So let's take a look at what it looks like when this philosophy is in full swing. Big blockbuster boppets. I absolutely love Rayman Legends. I think it is one of the world's most perfect games. If you're looking for big finales that call on the player's accumulated knowledge and skills, it has a number of chase levels, bosses and set pieces to choose from, but I've gone with the first music level, Castle Rock. This is early in the game, so it's a lot less intense, but near the start of the game, with the capability and skill I picked up so far, this is what maximum engagement looked like. Obviously there is a lot of time pressure and chaining. You can also see the venting moments where Rayman is sliding or bouncing and the pressure drops and it creates a break in the chain. So far the Rayman Boppet doesn't have very many actions, but even the two options are enough to create variety. Genichiro is widely regarded to be one of the most outright enjoyable battles in Sekiro, and I believe it is because he arrives at the perfect time, right when the player is ready for him. Just like a good level design, a good boss is a collection of obstacles, all of which the player has faced before. Genichiro's moveset features all the attack categories we discussed earlier: projectiles, grabs, sweeps, thrusts, along with a set of combos that test basic parrying and rhythm. Players can quickly learn this particular dialect of the game's language, the way he telegraphs his different attacks and such, and after that they can approach the battle with complete confidence. As in all From Software games, the risk pressure is extreme and heightens the tension around every choice. Only a few mistakes and you'll be dying the titular 2 times. Genichiro's got pretty short startups on his actual attacks, but he does provide a lot of warning that he's going to do something, allowing you to know when to enter and exit the readiness state, rather than being stuck in it throughout the entire battle. Here I use those times to strike back at him, which is another reason this battle is so fun, the push and pull and back and forth between acting and reacting. Whereas many Soulsborne Akiro battles revolve around trial and error and surprise, Genichiro is a clean skill check machine who never asks players a question they don't already know the answer to. Well, in his first phase anyway. The Doom Eternal team did what they set out to do. They made the right way to play the only way to play. They did this with extremely overt obstacle and action relationships. In their case, they paired weapons with enemies or specific enemy categories, and they paired resources with actions. They call this toolbox design, and it means that when players see a demon, they always know exactly what to do. As you can see, there are the slow motion moments on the weapon swapping, and on my aiming, thanks to an optional ability that I've got equipped. But any good review will tell you that the major punctuation beats in New Doom are the glory kills. The pressure in player choices is very high in Doom Eternal, which will squeeze out players who aren't coming in with enough natural affinity for the genre. But if you can find a difficulty mode that gets you in on the ground floor, then Eternal can strap you on a rocket to the high engagement state and keep you there for almost every battle. Not sure it would make a very good boppet though. A lot of work went into preparing these moments. It isn't just about creating a big challenge, it's about bringing up the player's capability to match the challenge that you want to give them. A player feels most engaged whenever they are hanging on to victory, but they feel they might lose their grip at any second. Alright, and with that I'll end with one of my favourite pearls of gaming wisdom from when The Simpsons was good.
I can't do this, Bart. I'm not strong enough. I thought you came here looking for a challenge. Duh! A challenge I could do.
Thanks for listening. Hopefully you didn't find that too boring or too overstimulating. We have a bit of time left on the clock, so before I relinquish control to real-time Steve in the chat for some Q&A, hey Steve, I want to devote 5 minutes to some alternative takes on the topic of player engagement. When researching this talk, I came across a number of, let's say, neighbouring philosophies, many of which I loved and really got me thinking. I didn't want to change too much of what I had planned to say here, or replace my words with a mishmash of other people's words, so instead I thought I'd talk about them here at the end. Firstly, my philosophy here is extremely geared towards reactions, the ways that we can push players to do things by throwing stuff at them. Well, I read an article by narrative designer and overall cool Twitter guy, Doc Burford, where he talked about reactive and proactive play. Proactive play is somewhat accounted for in the analysis phase, but no doubt this talk is disproportionately focused on reacting, rather than arming players to drive and control encounters, which is especially important for conflict engagement and combat design. Doc linked to a Gamasutra article by Thomas Grip, creative director of Frictional Games, that blew things wide open for me. While my approach revolves around the flow of choices, Grip's philosophy revolves around the flow of plans. You should read the article yourself because it's great, and I'm only going to paraphrase it here in a very reductive way, but essentially it puts forward the idea that the most vital element of engagement is the player's ability to make plans about what will happen and then attempt to make reality match that plan. Grip suggests you imagine players as having a second version of the game in their head, a mental simulation of the game's rules as they understand and expect them to behave, and a plan's success is based on how closely their simulation matches how the game actually works, after skill checks and such. And I love this concept, and I've immediately absorbed it into my own approach and way of doing things. If my flow is a good guide for reactive play, then his is a perfect guide for enabling the even more advanced proactive play. Grip also draws in a theory neighbouring his, which is a player experience of need satisfaction. It's a big article, but the part I liked the most was a commodity identified as vital to engagement and satisfaction that they call competence, aka the player's sense of being good at something. For me, this is the primary satisfaction generated by being in the high engagement zone. As Todd Howard said at his DICE 2012 keynote, the emotion that games can give players that no other medium can is pride. And finally, I think it's worth talking just very briefly about subversion and disruption techniques. There is material for a whole other talk in here, but keeping it simple, you may have noticed that during the final stages of the talk, analysis and action became instinct and skill. And you might have thought, is instinct even thinking? Alas, not really. When a rule becomes so internalized the player can call on it at will, it can slip into routine and no longer generate engagement like it used to. When this happens, it can be necessary to introduce a new feature that twists, breaks, or invalidates a certain choice flow, if only temporarily or in certain scenarios, just to shake players out of the routine and generate new playstyles. Of course, this is a very delicate process, and taking away the player's favourite toys can backfire very easily. Alright, now that's actually it. It's a goodbye from me, Steve of the past. I will let the newer, slightly worse dressed Steve answer your questions. Hopefully you found that engaging. Eh?
Okay, and our first question is from Alec Priduk. When I was at King once, the management came with a decision that we don't make variety anymore. We don't invent new mechanics since our data shows that our players' retention drops on the levels with new mechanics. So we at King were inspired to make more of the same and more of the same, and perhaps innovate with old well-known mechanics. So do you think your players' love thinking advice is more for the core player audience?
Hey Oleg, first of all, thank you for the nice comment. It's good to know what people think during the video. Okay, and yeah, so you've kind of hit one of the answers, I think, with the audience thing. So as I mentioned towards the end of the video, some audiences aren't looking for maximum engagement, they're looking for something a bit more chill. And obviously, new mechanics force you into a discovery zone, analysis zone that is more intense, and that spikes the intensity and may bring you higher into the engagement than you want, because having maximum engagement isn't always the best thing. Also, though, I think that something I didn't really talk about is that whenever you get players who've been using a game for a long time, who are like towards the end of the game, or perhaps playing DLC or a service game or an update, once they get accustomed to the current flows and they get good at it and they feel good at it, I think they start to feel that they're entitled to their mastery. And whenever you bring in new mechanics that they have to learn, you kind of reset them into the starter flow, and they're like, this is not fair, I'm good at this game, So I think that perhaps the entitlement to mastery is part of the problem. Also, I think that you nailed it with the audience. Some people want lower engagement. They don't want you to bring in mechanics that force them into the space of learning. The variety can come from mechanics you already know. And in fact, as I used in the final examples like Rayman, etc., the mechanics being tested, the variety that they're using to test your engagement is actually using the stuff you already learned, not learning new stuff. So the act of learning new stuff, I actually had a section about discovery that I removed, but essentially like learning something can be satisfying also. It can be in itself a loop of choice, but I think that it also has a cost. It can also have its own frictions. And perhaps that audience was not willing to have that friction of learning a new thing in order to get good at a new thing. They wanted to continue being good at the thing they were already good at. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, the second question also from Oleg Priduk. Brace yourself, wink wink. Second question, the dispersion of fun, boring zones across different audience. How do you make game trailers to be appealing enough?
So although I did edit this video together, I don't consider myself to be like a video editing expert. But I think trailer making is kind of its own art form, but certainly the concept of pacing can be applied here. There's been a lot of talks and essays and books written about pacing at a kind of higher level. I was trying to use this talk to talk more about kind of the micro pacing in the moment of gameplay, but I think you can take the same lessons and kind of apply it to something like trailers or the whole game, which is that, you know, you need to kind of like spike and then vent the pressure. I think for different audiences are obviously going to bounce off trailers more easily. Usually you can get away with a short, fast opening that gives a big hit of what the game is about or what the movie is about. And it kind of hits an audience that has a low attention span. I've noticed that recently Hollywood has started putting these weird little montage openers on their trailers so that to make sure that nobody loses interest during this slow, like, you know, in a world. And nobody turns off at that point. They're immediately like, oh, there's the zombies. And I think for me, actually, that might be kind of overstimulating. It's too off-putting that ruins the pacing of enjoyment, if you will. But yeah, I think in terms of fun and boring zones, like in terms of trailers, I watched a brilliant video on Game Maker's Toolkit about that, which I thought had a lot of really good tips for how to pace a trailer in terms of like, you know, big opening, bit of a slow, bit of narrative, more gameplay, etc. But for me, I think that pacing is always going to be an up and a down. I might think that I'm a core gamer myself, and like I might think that I want a game to keep me at maximum all the time. But the truth is that if that happens, I'm probably going to burn out. So I do need to be given little breaks, even if I don't necessarily think that I want them. So that was more of a cluttered answer, but hopefully that nailed the major points.
Okay, and also we have a question from Viktor Kuruchkin. Hey, thanks for a nice talk. How do you evaluate there is your game on this chart? How to evaluate intensity and capability?
Cool. So in terms of intensity, like I think you can kind of work it out by the combination of the skill checks and pressures. Like if you're asking a player to do something that has no skill check and has no pressure, it's obviously very low intensity. If you ask them to, you know, make an accurate shot, then that's obviously a little bit more intense. And if you ask them to do it in a limited amount of time, and you're saying that if they don't do it in time, they're going to instantly die, and you're saying that they have to do that 3 times in a row, then obviously those things stack, and then the intensity stacks up, and you can kind of count that in a more clear way. The issue with working out evaluation of the player's capability is, of course, that the player's ability and various skills can't really be measured as easily with it, because natural ability is much harder to measure. A lot of, I mean, again, this is a whole separate like method of study, a whole separate kind of discipline. But evaluating and like reading the game's difficulty and quality. People do like surveys to make sure that people who are doing the testing, they kind of reveal what their experience is with the genres or previous games of that type. Also, people tend to be quite honest about their capability, I think, when they're coming on board. And I think you can kind of see it as well. Like if you are a core gamer, you can kind of judge by your own performance versus someone else's performance. Like, for example, we had a platforming section in the level once, and I was like completely nailing it. And then we brought someone in who hadn't been playing like dual analog stick games or more of a PC gamer. They didn't have that skill set, and they were just falling at these jumps, which I thought were really easy. So again, that's kind of more of you got to read it yourself as a qualitative thing. It's less clear what the player's capability is. You have to kind of ask a lot of questions. I think it comes from their own experience with games of that type. I think that one of the best ways to allow players to manage their own capability is with difficulty modes, with difficulty modifiers, accessibility options. But yeah, evaluating it is kind of the same way as you evaluate any game's quality. You have to do testing. You have to bring people in. You got to play test. You got to have focus groups, and there's a lot of different like scientific techniques in terms of like laboratory testing of that stuff. So I think those are the only ways you're going to read the player's capability. But intensity, I think you can get a better idea of based on how you're stacking the experience. So hopefully that answers your question, Victor. Thank you for your nice comments as well.
As I see, there isn't any new questions and comments. Thank you very much, Steve, for your superb speech. It was great and very informative. And thank you for being here on DevGAMM Online. Большое спасибо.
Спасибо. Yeah.